We are going to read chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Pax. So if you will follow along, we are going to start with chapter 4, which is on page 29. Not hunting for his grandfather's flashlight, that was the first mistake of the trip. The moon had lit Peter's way for maybe 2 hours before it had drowned beneath dark, thick clouds. He'd stumbled along in the dark for another hour before giving up. He'd slit open the sides of a garbage can to make a long mat and cut the other to wear as a poncho against the cold mist, and slept beside a culvert, his mitt for a pillow. Actually, slept was a wild overstatement, and when the first low sun rays stabbed his eyelids, he awakened cold and wet from whatever dozing he'd imagined. His first thoughts were of Pax. Where was he this morning? Was he wet and cold too? Was he afraid? "I'm coming," he said out loud as he rolled the garbage bags back into his pack. "Hold on." He ate a stick of cheese and a couple of crackers, slugged a long drink of water, and then laced his boots and climbed up to the road. He was stiff and sore, but at least his anxiety had relaxed its grip. He probably hadn't traveled much more than 7 or 8 miles, but there was still a whole day before his grandfather would get home from work and even suspect he was gone. According to the Atlas map, he probably had another 20 miles to go before hitting the highway. After that, he could turn west for the shortcut anywhere that looked promising. He'd sleep deep in the woods tonight, out of civilization, the riskiest part of the trip behind him. He wished he'd paid more attention as he'd driven with his father the day before. Mistake number 2. But he'd only recalled there'd been a single sleepy town right after they exited the highway, and then stretches of woodlands broken only by occasional farms. Peter walked for 5 full hours. Blisters formed on his heels and his shoulders ached from the pack. But every step brought him closer to Pax and the home he should never have left, and he felt hopeful. Until a little after noon, when he hit a cluster of buildings that passed for a town square. Immediately, it seemed every person he passed was eyeing him suspiciously, wondering why he wasn't in school he'd noticed a little while back. When a woman dragging a toddler stopped to stare outright, Peter pretended to study the window display in the hardware store beside him. In the glass, he saw his reflection, and the remnants of his hopeful mood melted. His hair was tangled with leaves, his sweatshirt streaked in mud, and his nose reddened with what promised to be a full-faced sunburn by the end of the day. The kid in the window looked like a runaway, one who hadn't prepared very well. He sensed the woman moving on, but before he could leave, a shadow loomed over his shoulder. "Need something, young man?" Peter looked up. A man in a blue jacket emblazoned with the store logo stood in the doorway, smoking. His arms were crossed over a sagging belly, and his hair was a thinning gray. But something about the way he was peering down his nose reminded Peter of a hawk he'd once seen searching for prey from the top of a cedar. He pointed to the window. Peter looked back at the display, seed packets and gardening tools. "Oh, no, I was just do you sell flashlights?" The man cocked his head and eyed Peter while he took a drag on his cigarette, and again Peter was reminded of the hawk. Finally, he nodded. "Aisle 7. No school today?" "Lunch break. Gotta hurry back." The man stubbed out his cigarette and followed him inside, hovering nearby while Peter chose the cheapest flashlight on the rack and a pack of AA, and even shadowed him as he checked out. Outside, Peter let out the breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. He wedged everything into his pack and headed back for the intersection. "Hey, kid." Peter froze. The man had followed him outside. He yanked a thumb over his shoulder. "School's that way." Peter waved and smiled, trying to act dopey and change direction. At the corner, he risked a glance over his shoulder. The man was still watching him. Peter took off, sudden trickles of sweat chilling down the back of his neck. He didn't stop running until he reached the school entrance and then cut for the parking lot. All he wanted to do was hide for a couple of minutes, maybe crouch behind a couple of pickups and figure out an escape route. But beyond the parking lot and the utility buildings, he saw something a whole lot more appealing. A baseball diamond curved into a lime green spring grass, and tucked behind the third base line, facing away from the school, an empty dugout. Peter stood at the top of the rise, looking down at the sight. He argued with himself for only a minute. He'd like to be moving, for sure, making time. But what if that guy had called the police? Hitting the road would be risky. Anytime he rested, he could easily make up at night since he had a flashlight now, and he was suddenly tired, bone dead tired. Mostly, though, it was the way the field looked so welcoming, as if it were inviting him in. Peter always felt good on a baseball field, and maybe that was a sign. He didn't think he believed in signs, but after the Coyotes last night, he wasn't sure he didn't. Peter adjusted his backpack and loped down the hill. In the dugout, the familiar mingled scents of leather, sweat, and stale bubble gum wrapped around him like a hug. Peter hurried into his other set of clothes and rubbed a handful of clay red dirt through his hair. When he left here, he sure wasn't going to look like any description the police might have. He filled his thermos from a water fountain, drank it all down, and filled it again. As he wriggled under the bench, he smiled, realizing that Pax would have chosen the same spot, protected, but with a good vantage point if he wanted to rest. An hour, that was all, and then he'd cut behind the school and pick up on the road again. Enough time that if the police had been called, they would lose interest. He arranged his baseball glove and lowered his head. Just an hour, he murmured. I won't even close my eyes. Chapter 5. So we're going back to Pax talking this time. This is my territory. Pax was so startled that he nearly toppled from the oak trunk he'd been drowsing on. All day he'd been keeping watch and seeing nothing larger than a grasshopper, and now there was a bright furred vixen. He had never seen another fox before, but he knew. Younger and smaller and a female, but a fox. Instinct told him also that the way she held her ears and tail erect meant she expected his submission. I hunt here. Pax felt the urge to run back to his crude nest and press himself in the remaining stalks as if retreating to his pen, but he resisted it. What if his boy came back and he wasn't here? He flattened his ears to show he meant no threat, but that he would not leave. The vixen paced over, and Pax drew in her scent, as familiar as his own, but also exotic. She sniffed and bristled in distrust at the human scent on him. Pax had been born with that same instinct as well, but distrust is no match for kindness administered consistently and unmeasured, especially in creatures new to the world. Pax had only been 16 days old when Peter had rescued him, a fatherless, motherless curl of charcoal fur, his eyes barely opened, and it wasn't long before he'd come to trust the quiet, gangly boy who'd brought him home. The vixen poked her head snout in to sniff him. The vixen poked her pointed snout in to sniff him more closely and bristled again. The scent is my boy's. Have you seen him? Pax shared the most important features of his human, the naked round ears, the towering legs, so improbably long that Pax always feared he would topple over when he ran, the black curled hair that grew to different lengths and then became short again. No humans are here, but they are approaching. Just then, Bristle's head rose as if jerked on an unseen wire. Her ears pricked, trained on a slight rustling in a nearby tuft of broom sedge. Her rear began to twitch, gathering energy. She sprang high and then paused tight over her black nose, dived into the grass with a flash of a white-tipped tail. Pax sat up, alert. In a second, Bristle's head reappeared, and her jaws was a wood rat. She leaped clear of the grass, bit through the rat's neck, and then dropped it to the ground. Orphaned before he'd been weaned, Pax had never eaten raw prey. His hunger rose at the blood scent, and so did his curiosity. He took a cautious step closer. Bristle growled, and Pax retreated to watch from a safe distance. He grew hungrier as she crunched bites. He thought of the brimming comfort of his kibble bowl, the pleasure of Peter's hand-fed treats, and the ultimate reward, peanut butter. He needed to find his boy. His boy would feed him. Before he could ask about the approaching humans, Bristle picked up what remained of the rat, a single hind leg with its long tail, and stalked off with it dangling from her jaw. Pax watched as she wove her way between the grass tufts, becoming only flashes of flame and white, leaving. He was swept by the memory of his human's car roaring away in its stinging spray of gravel. Just before she slipped into the fringe of ferns at the wood's edge, she paused to glance at him over her shoulder. At that moment, a sharp snap from the fallen oak startled her. It was followed by a red streak of fur that hurtled from the dried foliage, flew over the weeds, and landed on her back. Pax flattened himself. He could hear the vixen's yipes as she scuttled with her attacker, but they sounded more irritated than afraid. He poked his head up. Bristle pounced on a ball of fur and bit it hard. To Pax's surprise, a smaller, skinnier version of herself unfurled at her paws. Pax was stunned. Never had he suspected that foxes might soar like birds, whose swooping arcs were not like any movement he himself could achieve. The little fox flipped back to his back and gave his belly in submission. But this seemed only to make Bristle angrier, her chattering now punctuated by jabs and nips. Pax bounded over, overcome by curiosity. The skinny fox startled at the unfamiliar human scent and looked over Bristle's shoulder. His eyes widened when he spied Pax, and he scrambled to his paws. Friendly, he announced to Pax, brother, but not littermate of the vixen. Play. Bristle bared her teeth and snarled at her brother. Dangerous. Stay away. Pax ignored Bristle's warning posture and met the greeting. Friendly. You flew. Bird? The little fox bounded back to the fallen oak and then sprang onto its trunk. One fork of the dead tree angled up. The small fox walked lightly along its length. He looked down to make sure Pax was watching. Pax dropped and tucked his paws under his chest, but it was hard to keep from leaping onto the tree to try it himself. He climbed the walls of his pen, of course, but he'd never been higher than at 6 feet. His brush twitched. The vixen stalked a few steps away and then dropped to the ground. She rolled onto her side to gaze directly up at her brother, her love for him obvious now. He was a runt. He's small, but he's tough. I don't want him with me when I hunt, but he follows me. She tossed her head and growled at Pax as though blaming him for her brother's play. The runty little fox stepped out along the branch, tail poised for balance, then coiled himself and leaped out over the heads of the earthbound foxes. He landed in a clump of burdock beside the road and then burst out covered in burrs. He tore around in mad circles as if soaring had filled him with an excess of joy that had to be spent through his legs, and then flung himself onto the ground to roll out the rest. His sister pounced on him. Too close to the road, while she purred the burrs from his coat. She scolded him for the recklessness of his flight, but Pax marveled at it. A good 5 full bounds he'd traveled without touching his paws to the ground. He would try the feat himself one day. When Runt managed to get to his feet, he lowered his head and nuzzled his sister. She knocked him back to the ground, only mock rough this time, and then sat on him, pinning him down. He struggled a little bit, but never really tried to upset her, and he protested only meekly when she began to groom him. Pax settled himself a respectful distance away. After a while, her brother, now properly subdued and her irritation spent, Bristle retrieved the morsel of rat and dropped it in front of him. She lay down and began to lick her paws and then clean her face with them. Pax edged closer, so low that his belly brushed the ground. The company of these 2 foxes drew him, whether he was welcomed or not. Bristle stretched out in a patch of slanting sunlight. Her damp cheeks glistened like the pumpkin-colored wood of the table where Pax's humans ate their food, brilliant against the white of her sleek throat. Pax looked over at Runt, who was sniffing the spot where Pax had slept. His coat markings were identical, but not as vibrant. His fur was sparse and tufty in places, and his hip bones protruded at sharp angles. He reared back suddenly and pounced in mock attack. Pax watched as Runt tossed the toy soldier into the air and then pinned it down over and over. He'd done the same thing as a kid. He trotted over and joined the game, and Runt welcomed him as though they had played together since birth. Bristle got to her feet. Bring it here. Her brother ignored her for a moment, but then, as if he had been judging the limits of his sister's patience, he lopped over and dropped the toy at her paws. Bristle issued a throaty rattle at the soldier. Human. Leave it. Home. Now, she ordered her brother. Runt leaned into Pax and braced his forelegs. Bristle sprang up to nip at her brother. He stinks of the humans. Remember. Pax was startled by the image she communicated to her brother then. A cold, howling wind, a mated pair of foxes, struggling with something that reminded Pax of his pen. Steel, but with jaws and clamps instead of bars. The steel jaws and the snowy ground were smeared with blood. Bristle tipped her head to assess the sky and sniff the breeze, which carried the threat of thunderstorms from the south. Home. Runt lowered his tail and began to follow his sister, but then he turned back to Pax, inviting him to come as well. Pax hesitated. He didn't want to leave the spot his human would return to, but dark clouds were rolling in, and just then thunder boomed in the distance. He knew his boy would not venture out during a storm. He didn't want to think of getting drenched by the side of the road, alone. He tucked the toy soldier into his cheek and set out after the two foxes. Bristle turned when she sensed his presence. One night only, human stinker. Pax agreed. He would follow his scent back to the road after the storm. His humans would come for him then, and once he found his boy, he would never leave his side. All right, so now we're on chapter 6. You can see the face of the boy. So we are back with Peter narrating from his point of view. Peter recognized the sounds before he was fully awake. The footfalls of a herd of just released kids, their hoots, the thumping of their eager fists into gloves. He scrambled out from the bench and grabbed his stuff. Too late. 20 boys and their coach were streaming down the hill. Up at the parking lot, a bunch of adults were overseeing the dismissal, and some of them wore uniforms. His best option was to join the dozen or so kids who were already scattered over the bleachers, heads bent together in clusters of 2 or 3, and blend in when they left. Peter climbed the bleachers to the top row and dropped his pack. A kid watching a baseball practice. Nothing could be more normal, yet his heart skidded. Below, the coach started lobbing fungos into the field. The players were mostly the usual guys you expect to see on a ball field, all muscle and shout. Peter found the one he wanted to watch, a small kid with a straw-colored crew cut and a bleached-out red t-shirt, playing shortstop. While the rest of the players scrambled around like puppies, this kid was a statue, hands poised waist high, eyes glued to the coach's bat. The instant the wood smacked cowhide, he sprang. Somehow, he managed to reach every ball that came anywhere near his territory, even though he was short. So short that he looked like someone's tag-along kid brother. Peter knew he himself wasn't the kind of kid you'd expect to find on a ball field either, and he was even less at home in the dugout with all the shoulder punching and trash talking. But a baseball field was the only place where he felt he was exactly where he was born to be. The feeling that brought Peter was something he had never even tried to describe to anyone else, partly because it felt too private, but mostly because he didn't think he had the words to explain it. Holy came the closest, and calm was in the mix, but neither was exactly right. For a crazy minute, Peter sensed that the shortstop understood about the holy calm and was feeling it too right now. The coach had taken the mound and was tossing puffballs. The batters were hitting sharp liners and grounders, and the outfielders were finally paying attention, or at least facing in the right direction. The shortstop was still the one to watch. He looked like he was stitched together with live wires, gaze steady to the play. Peter recognized that kind of concentration. Sometimes his eyes would actually go dry because he forgot to blink. So focused was he on every move of every player, and knew it paid off. Like the kid in the red t-shirt below him, Peter owned his territory on a ball field. He loved that territory right down to the cut grass, dry dust smell of it. But what he loved more was the fence behind it, the fence that told him exactly what was his responsibility and what wasn't. A ball fell inside that fence, he'd better field it. A ball soared over it, and it wasn't his to worry about anymore. Nice and clear. Peter often wished that responsibility had such bright, tall fences around it off the ball field, too. When Peter's mother had died, he'd gone for a while to a therapist. At 7 years old, he hadn't wanted to talk, or maybe he just hadn't known how to shrink that kind of loss into words. The therapist, a kind-eyed woman with a long silver braid, said that was okay. That was perfectly okay. And for the whole session, Peter would pull little cars and trucks from a toy box. There must have been 100 of them in there. Peter figured later that the woman had cleaned out a toy store for him and crashed them together, 2 by 2. When he finished, she would always say the same thing. That must have been hard for you. Your mom gets in a car to go buy groceries a regular day, and she never comes home. Peter never answered, but he remembered a sense of rightness about those words and about the whole hour, as if he was finally where he should be, and there was nothing else he should be doing except crashing those little cars and hearing that it must have been hard for him. Until one day, the therapist said something else. Peter, do you feel angry? No, he said quickly, never. A lie. And then he'd gotten off the floor and taken a single green apple Jolly Rancher from the brass bowl by the door, exactly the way he did it at the end of every session. That was the deal the kind-eyed therapist had made with it. Whenever he'd had enough, he could take a candy and the session would be over, and left. But outside, he kicked the candy into the gutter, and on the way home, he told his father he wasn't going back again. His father hadn't argued. In fact, it had seemed a relief to him. But not to Peter. Had the nice therapist known all along he'd been angry that last day, that he'd done something terrible, that as a punishment his mother hadn't taken him to the store? And did she blame him for what happened? A few months later, Peter had gotten Pax. He'd come across a fox run over by the side of the road near his house. So soon after watching his mother's coffin lowered into the ground, he'd felt an unshakable need to bury the body. As he looked around for a good place, he found the den, filled with 3 cold, stiff kit bodies and one little ball of gray fur still breathing. He tucked Pax into his sweatshirt pocket and brought him home and said, not asked, said, I'm keeping him. His dad had said, okay, for a while. The kid mewed piteously all through the night, and hearing him, Peter had thought that if he could visit the kind-eyed therapist again, he'd smash those toy cars together all day and all night forever. Not because he was angry, but just to make everybody else see. Thinking about Pax made the old anxiety snake tighten around Peter's chest. He needed to get moving again, make up some time. The practice was breaking up now, boys lopping in from the field, shedding equipment as they streamed past the dugout. As soon as the field was clear, he dropped from the bleachers, pulled his backpack down, and hitched it over his shoulders. Just as he set out along the diamond, though, he saw the shortstop. Peter hesitated. He should take off, try to blend in with the stragglers leaving the school grounds. But the rest of the team had left this kid to bag up the equipment and walk back home, and Peter knew how that felt. He picked up a couple balls and handed them over. Hey. The boy took the balls with a cautious smile. Hey. Nice play. The last liner, that ball had hair. The boy looked away and scuffed at the dirt, but Peter could see he was pleased. Yeah, well, the first baseman made it look cleaner than it was. Nah, you planted that ball. Your first baseman would be lucky to catch a cold by himself. No offense. The boy gave Peter a real grin. Yeah, coach's nephew. You play? Peter nodded. Center field. You new here? Oh, I don't live here. He nodded his head vaguely south. Hampton? Yeah, Hampton, right. The boy's face closed. Scouting before Saturday's game? Jerk. He spat and walked back to the dugout. As he left the school grounds, Peter congratulated himself on his quick thinking, covering his runaway tracks, but somehow he felt kind of bad anyway. Somehow he felt lousy, actually. He shrugged the feeling off. What was it his dad had said about feeling? Something about a quarter and a cup of coffee? He checked his watch. 4:15. He'd lost over 3 hours. Peter pressed faster, but when he came to the town square again, he crossed to the opposite side from the hardware store and forced himself to walk at an even pace, past a library, past a bus station, past a diner. And then he counted off 1,000 steps before he risked lifting his head. When he did, he checked his watch again. 4:50. His grandfather was probably packing up his stuff now. Peter imagined him walking to his rusty blue Chevy, fitting the key in the ignition. And with that image, his anxiety struck, knocking the breath right out of him. He scaled a low wooden fence and dropped into a scrubby brush. He pushed in a good, safe 30 feet until the saplings rose up taller than he was, until his anxiety let him breathe right again, before turning to parallel the road. It was rougher going now, but 15 minutes later, he reached it, the highway. Peter shadowed the entrance ramp, crouching low, then at a break in traffic, ran down the culvert, scaled the chain link fence, and dropped to the other side, his heart beating hard. He'd made it. He lopped into the trees, keeping an eye out for a likely place to cut west. And in just a few minutes, he found one, a dirt road running perpendicular to the highway. Well, not much more than an old wagon path, to be honest, but it was heading in the right direction and would be easy walking, even at night. He turned in. For a short while, the trees beside him grew denser as he walked, and only bird calls and squirrel rustlings broke the silence. Peter realized that he might have seen the last of civilization for a while. The thought lifted him. But a few minutes later, the road turned a corner and began to run along an old pasture dotted with gnarled fruit trees in ragged bloom. A stone wall bordered the field, and a low barn stood at the far corner. There were no lights on in the barn, no car or truck beside it. Still, Peter's heart crashed. The barn looked freshly painted, and some of the roof shingles were in the raw pink of new wood. This was the road to someone's home. Worse, it might lead to a bigger road the atlas had been too old to show. In any case, it wasn't a shortcut across the hills. Peter dropped his pack and sank into the narrow jog in the stone wall, exhausted and starving. He tugged his boots off and peeled down his socks. 2 bad blisters throbbed on each heel. They were going to kill when they broke up. Peter dug out his extra pair of socks from the bottom of the backpack and worked them over on the first foot. He rested his head back against the rough stone, still giving off a little warmth from the day's sun, which was now hovering just over the line of trees, bathing the field in peach-colored glow. He pulled the raisins out and ate them one at a time, taking small sips of water in between. Then he opened 2 packets of string cheese and took 4 crackers from the sleeve. He ate as slowly as he could, watching the sun over the orchid, surprised to find that he could actually mark its sinking movement. How had he lived 12 years and never known about sunsets? Peter laced his boots. Just as he started to rise, he caught sight of a deer, which bounded into the orchard from the woods beyond. He held his breath as the orchard filled. 14 deer in all. They began to graze, and a few nibbled delicately at the low branches of the trees. Peter squatted back down, and the closest one, a doe with a spindly, spotted fawn beside her, turned her head to look directly at him. Peter raised his palm slowly, hoping to let her know he meant no harm. The doe moved between Peter and her fawn, but after a while, she dipped her head into the grass again. And then the clear twilight air was split by the screech of a saw biting through the wood from behind the barn. The herd startled in unison and peeled away into the darkening woods, their white tails flashing. Before she bounded off, the doe sent another look straight at Peter, one that seemed to say, "You humans, you ruin everything." Peter took off. Back at the highway, half the cars had their headlights on now, and it seemed they were all trained directly on him. He ducked off the road. The ground there was spongy and smelled of peat. He was just debating about risking the flashlight when his foot sank with a splash. He grabbed an overhanging branch and pulled himself out, but it was too late. He could feel cold swamp water seeping into his boots. Peter cursed. Not bringing more socks. Another mistake. It had better be the last of the trip. And then clambering back to higher ground, he made another, much worse mistake. His right foot caught on a root and he fell. He heard the bone break, a soft, muffled snap. At the same time, he felt the sharp stab. He sat panting with a stunning pain for a long moment. Finally, he pulled his foot free and unlaced his boot, wincing at the motion. He eased down the wet socks, and what he saw made him gasp. His foot was swelling so fast that he could actually see it. Peter rolled his socks back up, nearly crying out at the pain it caused, then gritted his teeth to work his foot back into the boot before it could swell even more. He crawled to a tree and pulled himself upright. He tested his weight on his foot and nearly collapsed again. The pain was far worse than anything he'd felt before. It made the broken thumb feel like a mosquito bite in comparison. He couldn't walk. Okay, so that will leave us ready to start chapter 7 the next time.